The moment he set his own plate before her, the great hall fell into a silence so deep you could hear the tapestries weeping dust. She was Posy, a scullery maid, who ate the scraps from plates just like this one, a girl whose name was a forgotten whisper in the cavernous kitchens of the ducal estate. He was Lord Valerius, a visiting sovereign of shadows and ice, a being so ancient and powerful the Duke himself trembled when speaking his name. He was a king of a lightless kingdom, and she was a ghost in the daylight, a creature of soot and steam. The world had decreed she was nothing. His gesture decreed she was everything. But what no one in that silent, staring hall understood was that this was not about food, and it was not about favor. It was about a hunger that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. If you believe that being truly seen by one person can change your entire world, type "witness" below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the cold. Not just the cold of the flagstones on her bare feet in the pre-dawn hours, or the biting drafts that snaked through the castle's lower corridors. This was a different kind of cold. It radiated from the north wing, where the Duke's honored and feared guest was housed. It was a cold that felt ancient, a stillness that swallowed sound and leached the warmth from the very stones. Posy knew this cold intimately. It clung to the silver platters she scrubbed, a faint, unnatural frost that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It lingered in the hallways long after he had passed, a pocket of winter in the torchlight. The other servants whispered that Lord Valerius was not quite human. They spoke of the way candles guttered when he entered a room, of shadows that seemed to deepen and stretch at his feet, moving with a life of their own. Posy didn't have time for such whispers. Her world was one of scalding water, harsh lye soap, and the endless, back-breaking cycle of other people's appetites. She had come to the Duke's household a year ago, after her father's small tenant farm had failed, leaving her family with nothing. She was one of a dozen such girls, interchangeable, nameless, her presence marked only by the work of her hands. She was dismissed by everyone, from the haughty housekeeper to the other maids who had been there longer and knew the cruel algebra of a servant's hierarchy. Her wound was the quiet, constant ache of being invisible. Her days were a blur of steam and grease. Her nights were a brief, exhausted collapse on a thin straw pallet, only to be followed by the ache of rising again in the dark. The only time she felt a flicker of personhood was late at night, after the great hall was empty and the high table had been abandoned. It was her job to clear the final remnants, the dregs the higher servants didn't bother with. There, in the echoing silence, she would gather the leftover bread, the bits of meat, the bruised fruit. This was her meal, and the meal of the other lowest scullery hands, eating what the high table threw out. Lord Valerius had been a guest for a fortnight, and the entire estate was wound tight as a clock spring. He was a guest the Duke could not afford to displease. He was an aristocrat, yes, a lord of immense lands and untold wealth, but everyone felt the truth of him beneath the veneer of nobility. He was older than the stones of the castle, and his power was not in titles, but in the chilling stillness that surrounded him. One night, a grand banquet was held in his honor. The kitchens were a special kind of hell, a symphony of shouting, clanging pans, and the frantic rush to please a palate that, by all accounts, was impossible to please. Posy worked until her arms felt disconnected from her shoulders, scrubbing pots crusted with sauces she could only imagine the taste of. Hours later, when the last of the wine-drunk nobles had staggered to their beds and the hall was finally quiet. Posy entered with her wooden bucket. The cavernous room was a wreck of discarded finery and spilled wine. The air was thick with the ghosts of laughter and rich food. She moved through the debris, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, a small, tired shadow in the vastness. She worked her way toward the high table, where the Duke and his most honored guest had sat. The Duke's area was a disaster, a testament to his nervous gluttony. But Lord Valerius's place setting was different. It was almost untouched. A single slice of venison, perfectly cut, lay cooling on the porcelain. The wine in his goblet was dark and full. It was as if he had only pretended to participate in the feast. As she reached to clear the plate, her eye caught something else. Half hidden beneath a linen napkin was a small object, a little bird carved from some dark, polished wood. It was no bigger than her thumb, but the detail was breathtaking. Every feather seemed to be etched with impossible precision. It was a thing of exquisite, lonely beauty. She didn't know why she did it. It wasn't to steal. It was a compulsion, a moment of pure, unthinking wonder in a life that held none. She picked it up. The wood was cool and smooth against her calloused fingertips. She turned it over and over, mesmerized by the artistry, feeling the weight of the hours someone must have spent to bring it to life. For a moment, she wasn't a scullery maid. She was just a girl holding a beautiful thing. A floorboard creaked behind her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She spun around, clutching the little bird, her guilt immediate and suffocating. He was standing there, not 10 feet away, a pillar of darkness against the dying firelight. Lord Valerius. He hadn't made a sound. One moment the hall was empty. The next, he was simply there. The room grew instantly colder. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to pool and deepen, gathering at his feet like loyal hounds. She expected rage, a bellowing accusation, a summons for the guards. She braced for the blow, for the end of her miserable position here. But he was utterly still. His eyes, which she'd only ever glimpsed from a distance, were fixed on her. They were not black, as the servants whispered, but a deep, startling crimson, like the heart of a dying fire. And they held no anger. They held a piercing, unnerving curiosity. His gaze dropped from her face to her hand, where she was crushing the little wooden bird. She opened her palm immediately, an offering, an apology. He took a slow step forward. The air crackled around him. "You were not stealing it," he said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, quiet resonance that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It sounded like smoke and old wine. It was not a question. It was a statement. She could only shake her head, her throat too tight for words. "You were looking at it," he continued, his crimson eyes lifting back to her face. He was truly looking at her, not at the dirt on her cheek or her frayed dress, but at her. It was so direct, so focused, it felt like a physical touch. Why? The question was so unexpected. She fumbled for an answer. It's beautiful," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "The wings, they look like they could really fly." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. A deep, profound stillness settled over him. He looked at her for a long moment, his stare so intense that she felt the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was as if he were reading the last 10 years of her life from the lines on her face. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice still that same low thrum. No one had asked her that in months. Not the housekeeper, not the cook, not even the other girls she shared a pallet with. To them, she was just girl or you. To hear the question, spoken with such deliberate weight, was a shock. "Posy, my lord," she managed to say. "Posy," he repeated, the word tasting strange and significant in his mouth. He didn't say anything else. He simply held her gaze for another heartbeat, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked away, his form swallowed by the shadows at the far end of the hall, leaving her alone with the cold air, the untouched plate, and the echo of her own name. The next morning, the world turned upside down. Posy was on her knees, scrubbing the grime from the kitchen floor, when the housekeeper, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, stormed in. Her eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual disapproval, were wide with a kind of frantic shock. "You, girl!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Posy. "On your feet! The Duke requires you! Now!" A wave of dread washed over Posy. It was about the bird. Lord Valerius had reported her after all. She was going to be flogged, or thrown out, or worse. The other kitchen staff stopped their work, staring with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. To be summoned by the Duke himself was a death sentence for someone of her station. She was marched out of the kitchens. Upstairs she had never been permitted to climb. Through corridors of tapestry and polished wood. Her rough clothes and dirt-smudged skin felt like a crime in this opulent world. The housekeeper shoved her into a small antechamber outside the Duke's private study, her face pale. "Do not speak unless you are spoken to," she hissed, "and pray for your soul." The Duke was a portly man, sweating in his velvet doublet despite the chill that always seemed to follow his guest. Lord Valerius stood near the window, a figure of calm, dark authority, looking out over the frosted grounds. The shadows in the room were unnaturally deep. The Duke couldn't even look at Posy. He looked at a point somewhere over her shoulder, his voice strained. "Lord Valerius," he began, then cleared his throat. "Lord Valerius has made a request, an unusual one." Posy kept her eyes on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Valerius who spoke. His voice cut through the Duke's stammering like cold, clean glass. "I require a new personal attendant during my stay," he said, turning his head slightly. His crimson eyes found her, even with her head bowed. "I have chosen her." The silence that followed was deafening. Posy's head snapped up. The Duke looked utterly bewildered. The housekeeper, lingering in the doorway, made a small, strangled sound. My lord," the Duke stammered. This is a scullery maid. She is unsuited. She has no training, no letters, no graces. We have dozens of ladies in waiting, skilled valets." "I do not require a lady in waiting," Valerius stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I require Posy." He said her name again, and it was a shield. "She will be moved to the north wing. See that she is provided with suitable attire and quarters adjacent to my own. Immediately." The Duke, caught between the absurdity of the request and the absolute terror of refusing it, simply nodded, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. "Of course, my lord. As you wish." Posy was dismissed with a wave. The housekeeper grabbed her arm, her grip like iron, and hauled her from the room. The woman was vibrating with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Once they were in the corridor, she shoved Posy against the wall. "What did you do?" she snarled, her face inches from Posy's. "What witchcraft have you worked?" Posy could only shake her head, speechless. She was as lost as they were. She was taken from the sweltering, noisy world of the kitchens, and plunged into a new one of silent, cold luxury. Two bewildered maids were tasked with bathing her, scrubbing the ingrained soot from her skin until it was raw. Her rough woolen shift was taken away and replaced with a simple, soft dress of dark blue wool. Her hair, usually tied back in a greasy knot, was washed and brushed until it hung soft and clean down her back. She was then led to the north wing. The air grew colder with every step. The torches here seemed to burn with a dimmer, bluer light. The wing was silent, opulent, and utterly deserted. She was shown to a room that made her gasp. It was larger than the entire kitchen dormitory. A fire was laid in the hearth, though it gave off little warmth. There was a soft bed with clean linens and a window that looked out onto a private, moon-dusted garden. She was terrified. This wasn't a reward. It was a cage. A beautiful, terrifying cage. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap, waiting for the other shoe to drop. What did he want from her? What did a creature like him do with a girl like her? Hours passed. The sky outside the window deepened to indigo. A soft knock came at the door. It was him. He entered without waiting for a response, a tall silhouette against the dim hallway. The shadows in her room seemed to sigh and stretch as he entered, flowing towards him. He was not dressed in the formal attire of the banquet, but in a simple dark tunic and trousers, which somehow made him seem even more imposing. "You are afraid," he observed, his voice calm. "Yes, my lord," she whispered. "You believe I have brought you here to harm you." She couldn't answer. She just stared at him, her fear a living thing in her chest. He moved to the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the new dress, the clean hair. "They have made you presentable. Good." He paused, his crimson eyes fixing on her with that same unnerving intensity. "Your duties will be simple. You will attend me. You will keep me company. You will do as I ask. Nothing more." "But what will you ask?" She finally found the courage to ask. A strange, almost melancholic look crossed his face. "I will ask you to tell me things," he said softly. "That is all. For now you will rest. You are no longer a scullery maid, Posy. That life is over." He turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving her alone in the chilling silence, the meaning of his words hanging in the air like frost. He hadn't just claimed her, he had erased her past, and she had no idea what he intended to write in its place. Her new life began in the library. It was a vast, circular room, 2 stories high, lined from floor to ceiling with books that smelled of leather, dust, and time. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, but its heat seemed to be swallowed by the immense, cold space. Lord Valerius sat in a large carved wooden chair by the fire, a heavy tome open but unread on his lap. Posy stood nervously by the door, unsure of what to do. "Come," he said, not looking up. "Sit." He gestured to a smaller, more comfortable chair placed opposite his. Hesitantly, she obeyed, perching on the edge of the cushion. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind against the leaded glass windows. "Tell me about your father's farm," he said suddenly. The question caught her completely off guard. "My lord?" "The farm," he repeated, his gaze still on the fire. "Where you lived before you came here. Describe it to me." She swallowed, her mind scrambling. Why would he want to know about that? It was a place of failure, of loss. It was small, my lord. Just a few fields. We had 2 cows and some chickens. No, he said, a hint of impatience in his voice. He finally turned his head, and his crimson eyes pinned her to the chair. Do not tell me what was there. Tell me what it was like. The specifics, the details. She hesitated, then began again, her voice small. The soil. It was dark and rich after a rain. It smelled of earth and damp stone. In the mornings, the mist would hang so thick in the hollow you couldn't see the fence line. It would cling to your clothes, cold and wet. She paused, lost for a moment in the memory. My father, he used to say the morning smelled of new beginnings. She glanced at him, expecting a dismissal, but he was watching her with an almost hungry stillness. His eyes were closed, as if he were trying to see what she was describing. Continue, he commanded, his voice a low whisper. And so she did. She told him about the scratchy feel of hay in the barn, the low, contented sound a cow makes when it's being milked, the sharp, clean scent of an apple picked fresh from the tree, the way the sun felt on her face after a long winter. She spoke for over an hour, dredging up small, forgotten sensations. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the effort of memory, he opened his eyes. There was a profound, ancient sadness in them. I have lived for more centuries than this castle has stood, he said, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of those years. I have seen empires rise and crumble to dust. I have tasted the rarest wines, heard the most beautiful music, touched the finest silks, and I feel none of it. He gestured to the fire. I see the light. I understand the principle of heat, but I cannot feel its warmth. It is merely data, information. He looked at the untouched book in his lap. These words are shapes on a page. The stories within them have no power to move me. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. For a very long time, the world has been a faded tapestry. The colors are muted. The textures are gone. It is a collection of facts without feeling. A banquet I can see and smell, but never, ever taste. He paused, and the silence in the room felt different now. It was filled with his confession, with the vast, cold emptiness of his existence. Last night, he continued, in the hall, when I saw you with the carving, you were not just looking at an object. You were experiencing it. The wonder, the appreciation for its beauty. It was so pure, so potent, and for a fleeting second, standing there watching you, I felt an echo of it, a ghost of a memory of what it was like to feel such a thing. He finally revealed the heart of it, the reason she was here. That is why I chose you, Posey. You are not muted. You are not faded. Your perceptions are vibrant. I want you to be my senses. I want you to taste the food and tell me of it. I want you to feel the warmth of the fire and describe it to me. I want you to look at the world and lend me your eyes, your heart, so that I might remember what it is to be alive. The truth of it settled over her, vast and terrifying, and strangely, deeply moving. He hadn't brought her here for some cruel, monstrous purpose. He had brought her here because he was drowning in an eternal winter, and he thought she might be a flicker of candlelight. He, the great and powerful Lord Valerius, the dreaded vampire king of whispers and nightmares, was lonelier than anyone she had ever known. He was asking her to live for him, to be the bridge between him and a world he could no longer touch. Would you agree to be a ghost's senses, to live for someone who has forgotten how? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Posey looked at the ancient, powerful being before her, and for the first time, she felt no fear. She felt a wave of dizzying, unexpected compassion. All her life she had been overlooked, dismissed as unimportant. Her feelings, her perceptions, her small joys and sorrows, they had mattered to no one. And now, this creature of immense power was telling her they were the most valuable things in the world. He was telling her that her experience of being alive was something he craved. "I will," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will try, my lord." A change occurred in him. It was subtle, a slight relaxation of the rigid line of his jaw, a lessening of the predatory stillness in his posture. It was as if a cord that had been stretched taut for 1,000 years had just been given a fraction of slack, and so their strange ritual began. Every evening, a meal was served for two in the North Wing's private dining hall, a grand table set with silver and crystal, but only one place setting was ever used. Posey would sit, and a plate of the finest food from the kitchens would be set before her. Lord Valerius would sit opposite, a goblet of his dark, untouched wine before him, and he would watch her. "The soup," he would command softly. "Begin." At first, she was clumsy, self-conscious. "It is hot, my lord. It is a mushroom soup." "No," he would correct, his voice patient but firm. "Posey, describe it. Do not name it." So she tried again. "The warmth spreads from my mouth all the way down to my stomach," she said, closing her eyes to concentrate. "It's a very deep, earthy taste, like the smell of the forest floor after it rains. And there is something else, a sharpness, like pepper, that prickles on the tongue for just a moment." She would open her eyes to find him watching her, his own eyes closed, his expression one of intense concentration. He was listening as if her words were music, as if he were trying to assemble the sensation from the pieces she gave him. They moved through entire meals this way. She described the flakiness of a pastry, the burst of juice from a ripe plum, the way the salt on the roasted meat made her mouth water. She learned a new language, a vocabulary of sensation. She, who had eaten leftovers her whole life, was now a connoisseur of flavors, not for her own pleasure, but for his. Their time was not confined to meals. He would have her walk in the frozen gardens, then return and describe the crisp, fragile sound of frosted leaves under her boots. She told him of the scent of pine smoke on the winter air, the weight of a heavy velvet curtain in her hand, the way moonlight looked scattered across a frozen pond. She read to him from his endless collection of books, not just the words, but the feeling of them. She would describe the tension in a scene, the heartbreak of a character's loss, the joy of a triumphant return. She gave him the emotion that he could no longer glean from the ink. In return, he began to share pieces of his own vast, lonely existence. He never spoke of his vampiric nature directly, but he talked of history as if he had been there. He spoke of watching the great cathedrals of the world being built, stone by stone. He described the scent of the ancient library of Alexandria. He told her of conversations with poets and philosophers, whose names were now just legends. She stopped seeing him as a monster. She saw a man trapped in eternity, a prisoner of his own immortality. The coldness she had once feared now seemed like a symptom of his profound isolation. The shadows that followed him no longer seemed menacing. They seemed protective, a physical manifestation of his solitude. Sometimes, when she was describing something particularly warm or joyful, she would see them recede, just slightly, as if shrinking from a light they had not felt in centuries. One evening, they sat by the library fire as a storm raged outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the castle's turrets. Posey was describing the simple comfort of the fire, a feeling she had rarely known in her life before now. "It's not just the heat," she said, staring into the flames. "It's the color, the way the orange and yellow dance together. It feels alive. And the sound, the crackling, it's a comforting sound. It makes the storm outside feel far away. It makes the room feel safe." Her hand was resting on the carved arm of her chair. As she spoke, she felt a sudden, shocking cold cover it. She gasped and looked down. He had reached across the space between them and placed his hand over hers. His skin was impossibly cold, like marble unearthed from deep in the ground. It was not the damp cold of the scullery, but a dry, absolute absence of warmth. Her first instinct was to pull away, but she didn't. She looked at his face. His eyes were fixed on their joined hands. His expression was one of desperate, fragile hope. "Describe it," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Your hand. Under mine. Describe the warmth." Her heart ached for him. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. His were long and elegant, but held a stillness, a lack of life that was deeply unsettling. Her own hand felt small and fragile and incredibly, powerfully alive against his. "My skin. It feels like the fire," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The warmth is pooling where you are touching it. My pulse is beating against your palm. Can you feel it? It's the beat of my life, and it's pushing back against your cold. Not fighting it. Just sharing the heat." He closed his eyes, and a shudder went through his powerful frame. It was not a shiver of cold, but of sensation. For the first time, he was not just hearing her words. He was anchored to the source. He was touching the warmth he craved. He stayed like that for a long time, his cold hand enveloping hers, his face a mask of silent, profound concentration. When he finally pulled away, the air where his hand had been felt strangely empty. He looked at her, and the hard, ancient mask of the vampire king was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so raw it stole her breath. "Thank you, Posey," he said, and the two words held the weight of 100 years of gratitude. From that night on, something shifted between them. The space separating their chairs grew smaller. His requests became more personal. He would ask her to describe the feeling of her own heartbeat, the taste of a tear on her lip after reading a sad passage, the simple contentment of a deep, restful breath. She was no longer just his senses. She was becoming his anchor to a world of feeling. And she, in turn, was no longer just an overlooked girl. She was the keeper of a king's forgotten humanity. The Duke's court, however, was a viper's nest of jealousy and suspicion. The story of the scullery maid elevated to the north wing was a source of endless, malicious gossip. Most believed she was the powerful lord's concubine, a low-born plaything he would soon discard. One man saw it as an opportunity. Baron Edivane was a visiting noble, a rival of the Duke's with a reputation for cruelty and ambition. He was a man who collected secrets the way other men collected art. and he saw Valerius's strange attachment to a servant as a weakness to be exploited. He found Posey one afternoon in a long, sun-dusted gallery. Valerius had asked her to describe the way the light hit the portraits of the Duke's ancestors, to tell him if they looked proud or sad. She was alone, lost in her task, when the Baron appeared. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "The little kitchen mouse, far from her hole," he said, his voice slick with false charm. He circled her slowly, looking her up and down. "Quite the transformation. Tell me, what spells did you cast to so enchant our grim lord?" Posey stiffened, her hand tightening on the window ledge. "I don't know what you mean, my lord." "Oh, I think you do," he purred, stepping closer. The scent of his cloying cologne filled the air. "A man like Valerius does not elevate a nobody for no reason. He has a weakness for you. And a man's weakness is a powerful tool for a clever girl, or for her friends." He stopped directly in front of her, blocking her path. "He is a creature of secrets. I want to know them. You will listen, you will watch, and you will report to me. In return, when he inevitably tires of you and casts you aside, I will ensure you land softly, perhaps in my own service." His eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The Baron's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "No. You are in no position to refuse me, you little gutter rat. Do you think that dress changes what you are? You are dirt. He may have polished you for his own amusement, but you will wash away. I, on the other hand, can offer you a more permanent arrangement." "I said no," Posey repeated, lifting her chin. She was no longer the frightened girl from the scullery. The weeks with Valerius, being seen and valued, had forged a new strength in her. "He is my benefactor. I will not betray him." "You will regret this," the Baron hissed, reaching out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, the light in the gallery shifted. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed to dim, and the shadows in the corners of the room thickened, writhing like black smoke. A profound cold dropped into the air, sharp and immediate. Posey felt it first, a wave of possessive Arctic fury that was not her own. It was Valerius's rage, a silent, terrifying broadcast. Then, he was there. He did not walk from a doorway. He simply materialized from the deepest shadows near the end of the hall, moving with a speed that was not human. One moment he was a distant figure. The next he stood directly between Posey and the Baron, a wall of silent, absolute menace. Baron Edivane froze, his hand still outstretched, his face draining of all color. He stared at Valerius, his cruel bravado crumbling into pure, primal fear. Valerius did not look at the Baron. His crimson eyes were on Posey, a quick, assessing glance to ensure she was unharmed. The shadows around his feet swirled and coiled, a visible manifestation of his contained power. Then, he turned his head slowly, and his gaze fell upon Baron Edivane. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The lethal quiet of his words was more terrifying than any shout. "You will remove your presence from this gallery," Valerius said, his voice a low, deadly vibration. "You will not speak to Miss Posey again. You will not look at her again. You will not think of her again. She is under my personal protection. This is the only warning you will receive." The threat was unspoken but absolute. It promised not just political ruin, but utter annihilation. The Baron, shaking visibly, could only stammer, "My lord, a misunderstanding." "Go," Valerius commanded. Baron Edivane practically fled, scrambling backward before turning and hurrying down the gallery, his polished boots echoing his terror. The shadows in the room slowly receded, the temperature returning to normal. Valerius stood perfectly still, his back to Posey. She could feel the lingering rage coming off him in waves. She expected him to be angry with her, to see her as a liability, but instead of hiding or cowering, she took a step forward. "He was wrong about me," she said, her voice clear in the sudden silence. Valerius turned, a question in his eyes. "He called me a kitchen rat, a gutter rat," she said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He is wrong. That is not what I am." A slow, strange expression dawned on his face. It was not praise, not quite. It was respect. He had seen her fear, but he had also seen her defiance. She had not hidden behind his power. She had stood and claimed her own worth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the scullery maid he had found, nor the fragile sensorium he had cultivated. He saw a woman of quiet, unyielding strength, the woman he had seen in her all along. "No," he said, his voice softer now. "That is not what you are." He knew then that simply protecting her wasn't enough. The whispers and the scorn would continue as long as her status was ambiguous. He had to do more than hide her in the North Wing. He had to redefine her in the eyes of the world that had dismissed her. He had to reverse the wound. A few nights later, the Duke announced another formal dinner. The entire local nobility was in attendance, including a pale and subdued Baron Edivane, who kept his eyes firmly fixed on his plate. The great hall buzzed with gossip, all of it centered on Lord Valerius and his peculiar pet. They all expected the scullery maid to be absent, hidden away as usual. Just as the first course was about to be served, the great doors to the hall swung open. Lord Valerius entered, and on his arm was Posey. A collective gasp swept the room. She was not dressed in her simple wool attendant's dress. He had provided her with a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet that seemed to drink the light. It was simple, unadorned, but its perfect cut and rich fabric made the gaudy silks and jewels of the other ladies look cheap. Her hair was elegantly styled, and her face, though nervous, was composed and dignified. She was terrified. Every eye in the hall was on her, 100 pairs of eyes filled with shock, envy, and contempt. But Valerius's hand was a cool, steady presence on her arm, a silent reassurance. He walked with unhurried, regal grace, ignoring the stunned silence as if it were a matter of course. He did not lead her to a lesser table or to a forgotten seat at the end of the board. He walked directly to the high table, to the place of honor. He pulled out the chair directly beside his own, a seat reserved for a consort, a queen, and gestured for her to sit. Shaking slightly, she did. She was now seated higher than the Duke's own wife. She could feel the heat of Baron Edivane's glare from across the table. She could see the housekeeper, standing by the wall with the other senior servants, her face a mask of apoplectic disbelief. A servant, trembling, approached the high table with 2 plates laden with the first course, poached salmon with a dill sauce. He placed one before Lord Valerius and hesitated, looking utterly lost as to what to do with the second. Before anyone could give an order, Valerius acted. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he picked up his own untouched plate. The silver gleamed in the candlelight. The entire hall watched holding its breath. He leaned over and set his own plate down in front of Posey. The gesture was unmistakable. It was profound. He was not just giving her food. He was giving her his portion, his status, his honor. He was telling the entire world, "She is mine. She eats from my plate. Her nourishment is my concern. Her place is beside me." He then looked up, his crimson gaze sweeping over the silent, staring assembly. His eyes rested for a moment on the Duke, then moved to settle with chilling finality on Baron Edivane. "Miss Posey dines with me tonight," Valerius announced, his quiet voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "She will want for nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world being remade. In that single moment, Posey was no longer the scullery maid. She was no longer the kitchen rat or the gutter snipe. She was the chosen companion of the most powerful being any of them had ever known. Her humiliation was not just erased, it was reversed, thrown back in the faces of those who had inflicted it. He had seen her when she was invisible, and now he had made her seen by all. He then turned to her, his expression softening in a way no one else could see. "The salmon, Posey," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Tell me, does it taste of the sea?" And looking at him, with the entire world watching, she picked up her fork, and for the first time, she ate not just for him, but for herself. Months bled into a year. The Duke's estate was a distant memory. They resided now in his own ancestral home, a fortress of black stone and soaring towers called Castle Umbra, nestled in a valley perpetually wreathed in mist and shadow. Here, he was not Lord Valerius, a mysterious guest. He was the undisputed master, the vampire king. Posey was no longer his attendant. She was his companion, his confidant, the mistress of the castle. The vast, cold halls no longer felt empty. Her presence was the warmth that the fires could not provide. She filled the silence not just with descriptions, but with laughter, with questions, with her own thoughts. The change in him was subtle but profound. The deep, abiding melancholy in his eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was focused entirely on her. Through her, he had begun to experience the world again, not as perfect sensations, but as faint, beautiful echoes. He would sometimes close his eyes when she described the taste of wild strawberries, and a flicker of a smile would touch his lips, the ghost of a forgotten flavor. Her own transformation was no less complete. The girl who had been defined by soot and silence was now poised and assured. She managed the affairs of the great, shadowy castle with a quiet competence that earned the respect of its ancient, non-human staff. She had found her voice, her strength, her place. She was no longer a reflection of him. She stood beside him, a power in her own right. One night, they stood on a high stone balcony overlooking the Valley of Pines. A full moon bathed the landscape in silver light, and the air was sharp with the scent of cold stone and evergreen. He stood behind her, a silent, protective presence. She had grown so accustomed to his nearness, to the personal pocket of winter that always surrounded him, that she now found it comforting. "You have given me back the world, Posey," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "You gave me a world to begin with," she answered softly, not turning. "I was a ghost before I met you." "We were both ghosts," he corrected gently. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the sigh of the wind through the pines. She knew he was leading to something, a conversation they had never had, but that had lingered in the air between them for months. "My life is a stone in a river," he said finally. "The water flows past, but I remain. Yours is the water. It is swift and beautiful and fleeting." He was speaking of her mortality. He had never addressed it directly. It was the one great difference between them, the chasm that even their deep connection could not cross. "I will not lose you," he stated. The words simple, declarative, but holding a universe of pain at the thought. "I will not return to the silence. I will not watch you fade while I remain." He stepped to her side, and in the moonlight, his face was carved from shadow and sorrow. His crimson eyes held a plea that was centuries old. "There is a way," he said, "for you to remain with me, for the water to become stone. It is a choice I can offer, but never demand." He was offering her eternity, an endless life of nights, of shadows, of cold, beautiful stillness by his side. He was offering to make her like him. Posey looked out at the moonlit valley, then turned to him. She saw the vampire king, the ancient predator, the lord of shadows, but she also saw the lonely being who had been trapped in winter for 1,000 years, the man who had seen her worth when no one else had. She didn't answer with words. She reached out and took his cold, still hand. It was a feeling she now knew better than any other. She brought his hand to her face, pressing his cold knuckles against the warmth of her cheek. She held it there, closing her eyes, letting him feel the life that pulsed just beneath her skin, the life he cherished. He let out a slow, shuddering breath. He did not ask if she would stay. He did not ask for her answer. He already knew. "Describe it to me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And as the moon watched over the silent, sleeping valley, she did. She described the warmth of her own life against his eternal cold, not as two opposing forces, but as two parts of a whole, finally, perfectly, at peace. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate strength, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.